Hi. I've been following your discussion board on the Agenda 6 case, and I've been really impressed with the depth of thought that's gone into not only your initial response, but the way that you've reacted to your classmates. There are several times that, as I was reading along, I became interested in weighing in, and I had to hold myself back because I didn't want to interrupt the flow that was organically developing with the class. And I'm glad I did that, because as you built on your own ideas, it took on a flavor that I'm not sure that it would have if I'd interfered and sort of drawn the attention towards some of the ideas that I had at the time. But now that you've completed your posting, I did want to weigh in a little bit and talk about this case and most importantly reflect on the way that you approached it. And there were a few points that I particularly liked that I wanted to give you feedback as a group. The first thing is that as you looked at this complex issue, there was an immediate attention to trying to understand what you don't know. And so you looked at the case and you understood that there were some facts that were just missing from the case, that you had to fill in the gaps as you went, and that in filling in those gaps that you bring your own perspective and fill in the gaps differently. The other thing is that you noticed that other people were reporting the story differently themselves, that you could see that news media and actors that were actually involved in this case itself were interpreting the events differently and reporting them out differently. So it was interesting for me to watch, and I'm glad that you did that early on. In that initial perception and interpretation stage that we do, even as we're looking at a case secondhand, it's critical to examine what it is we don't know, and to what extent are we compelled to fill in those gaps ourselves. Another thing that I'm glad that people looked at was time, and what I mean by that is you looked at well, how does the administrator or the town itself, the grown-ups in this situation, as well as the teenagers, how do they react moving forward, as well as how could some of these problems had been prevented if we looked back and some different things had happened in this community or when these students were younger. And so what role does time play, and at what point are we talking about having an intervention, and how that would play out differently for the case itself. Another issue was perspective. So I thought people were generally very reflective in having a sense that there are multiple perspectives at play here, and trying to not just think about what you would do if you were in that situation, but to understand why the people in that situation acted the way they did. Some of the cultural norms, social pressures. At some point we got around to this idea of moral courage. And in understanding moral courage and to think about that, you're starting to think about the barriers to acting on what you know is right, as well as the barriers to knowing what's right. And you did both of those things as you looked at this case, and that's going to be an important theme moving forward. So I was very pleased to see that kind of perspective. One of the issues that we haven't really resolved in the discussion board is it might seem like a trite one at first, but as you found out in your discussion, the issue of the tree as a symbolic gesture is an interesting one, and I don't know that as a group you've come to any consensus about how to treat that cultural element of the tree itself and what it represents and how you deal with it. But that's going to be important moving forward as well, as we're going to be reading an article by Bowman and Deal next week that looks at, among other things, different symbolic elements that exist within a community culture, whether it's a community like a town or a community like a school or a workplace, and the role that those symbolic elements can play in driving how we think about what's right or what we should do when we're faced with a difficult decision. So I think that this discussion will come up again. Some of the elements that you were able to tease out of it will serve you well as you move forward and we look at some other types of cases. So the next case that we're going to look at is a school finance case. On its face, it's a school finance case, but what it's really about, even more than that, is people. And so as you read through the case, it's going to ask you to put yourself in a position of a school that's under fiscal distress and is having to make some very difficult choices about where to make some cuts. And all fingers are pointing towards making some personnel cuts. So as you look at this case, I want you to not just think about the finance part of it. This isn't a finance class, and it's not meant to be a particularly sophisticated financial case. You don't have to have a background in finance to be able to decipher the fiscal elements in it, but to think not just about what kind of decision you would make, but how you go about making the decision. And there are lots of different ways to make a fiscal decision, administrative decision, a personnel decision. Who you include in the decision-making process, what you consider as you're going through different steps of your own decision-making model, what kind of perspective you take when you're faced to finally make a decision, as well as how you communicate not just what you've decided, but the decision-making process itself. Who you communicate to, what media you use to communicate it, and what you're trying to say, what's your message. So I want you to think about those things, and as you're doing it, also think about how it's going to be perceived. Think about different perspectives within this school building and how they'll look at your decision, because if there's one thing we've learned in this class, it's that we can all look at the same problem, and we can have very different perspectives of what that problem means, and we can have very different reasons sometimes for even doing the same thing. So that'll be what we'll do moving forward. I'm not asking you to post on the financial case. Instead, I'm asking you just to digest it, think about it, have some really good answers to those questions prepared as you move into Thursday's Illuminate class. And we're going to do something a little bit different in Illuminate. You're going to start the Illuminate morning split up into groups, and there'll be some instructions for that on the website. There'll be a link that directs you to a page on our Google group. That's where the discussion boards are, and that page will give you hot links to your individual group. You'll spend some time in that group. I'll be floating around each of those groups, sort of listening in, observing, maybe adding a little bit. And then we'll all come together in the large Illuminate group, and we'll talk about this finance case study, and then also about a few other things as we move forward in the semester. So, great start to this week. Looking forward to hearing and seeing what you come up with on the finance case as we move into our Illuminate session.